Tom jolted awake to the deafening silence. Something was wrong. The rhythmic hum of his farm's irrigation system was missing. He rushed outside, heart pounding, to find his sprawling property shrouded in an eerie stillness. Where once the gentle gurgle of water had accompanied his morning routine, there was now nothing but a ghostly quiet and a distant metallic clatter. As he neared his field, his eyes widened in disbelief. There, stretching along the boundary of his land, was a gleaming 10-foot steel wall. Cold, unyielding, and impossibly straight, it barred the way like a fortress built overnight. For months, Tom had nurtured his modest farm stand and maintained a simple, charming wooden fence that marked his territory, a fence he'd crafted with pride and care. It was more than just a barrier. It was a statement of his independence and a symbol of his commitment to his land. But to the enforcer of suburban conformity, HOA Karen, it was an eyesore. Karen had made it her mission to police every minor detail in the community, and she had repeatedly complained that Tom's humble fence clashed with the pristine aesthetic of their upscale neighborhood. Tom had tolerated her tirades and her petty fines for far too long. But that morning, when he discovered the steel wall rising where his fence once stood, he knew that Karen's overreach had finally gone too far. This wasn't just about a fence. It was about his right to decide what belonged on his property. And as the sunrise glinted off the cold metal, Tom's determination burned hotter than ever. He knew that while Karen might have expected her petty complaints to mold the neighborhood in her rigid image, he was about to deliver a resounding message. Personal property and individual creativity would not be bullied into submission. The wall was a bold act of defiance, a physical, unyielding statement that Tom's land was his to shape. In that moment, as he ran his fingers along the cool steel, he silently vowed that no one, not even the self-appointed enforcer of community standards, could dictate his future. Today, Karen would learn that the boundaries of a property owner are not measured by the bland decrees of an HOA, but by the strength of one's resolve and the will to defend one's home. The stage was set for a confrontation that promised to upend the status quo and spark a revolution in Cedar Crest Estates. Cedar Crest Estates was the very picture of suburban perfection, a gated community where every home was painted in soft, muted tones, every lawn trimmed to an identical standard, and every decorative element carefully approved by the Homeowners Association, HOA. The association prided itself on preserving a uniform aesthetic, enforcing rules with an almost military precision. To residents, conformity was a badge of honor, and any deviation was met with swift penalties and public admonishment. At the heart of this relentless regime was Karen Mitchell, known to all as HOA Karen. In her early 50s, with her meticulously styled hair, sharp suits, and an ever-present clipboard, Karen patrolled Cedar Crest like a modern-day guardian of order. She was infamous for her rigid interpretation of the rules, whether it was the exact height of a hedge or the precise alignment of a mailbox. Nothing escaped her scrutinous gaze. Karen had built her reputation on ensuring that every property conformed to her vision of perfection, and she wielded her power with an air of self-importance that left little room for dissent. Tom, on the other hand, was a longtime resident with a very different philosophy. Having inherited a sprawling parcel on the outskirts of Cedar Crest, he had built a life centered on hard work, innovation, and the freedom to express his own style. His farm stand was a modest, vibrant hub of locally grown produce, artisanal goods, and the rustic charm of a man who had nurtured his land with both tradition and a dash of modern ingenuity. Central to his property was a wooden fence, simple, unpretentious, and full of character. It was a personal statement, crafted by his own hands, that marked his territory and celebrated the wild beauty of his homestead. Where Karen saw disorder in every crooked line or unsanctioned modification, Tom saw individuality, a testament to the independence that had been passed down through generations. His fence was not perfect by the HOA standards, but it was his, and it spoke of a life lived on one's own terms. Over the years, Karen had fined him for minor infractions related to his fence's design, claiming that its rustic appeal was detrimental to the community's image. Tom had tried to explain that his home was a sanctuary of creativity, a place where the natural imperfections of life were not only accepted but celebrated. Yet, Karen's narrow interpretation of the rules left him feeling increasingly stifled. The tension between these two worlds, Karen's rigid enforcement and Tom's fiercely independent spirit, had been simmering for months. Cedar Crest Estates, with its picture-perfect facade, masked a growing undercurrent of dissent among residents who longed for the freedom to live authentically. Many admired Tom's ability to maintain his property on his own terms, even if it meant bending a few of the HOA's inflexible rules. His farm stand had become a symbol of resistance, a reminder that personal expression and hard work were values worth defending, even in a community dominated by conformity. Then came the fateful morning when Tom discovered that his beloved wooden fence had been replaced with a towering 10-foot steel wall. It was a bold, almost theatrical act of vandalism that epitomized Karen's obsession with order. For Tom, it was the ultimate provocation, a direct challenge to his rights as a property owner. And as the steel wall glinted coldly in the early light, he knew that this was his moment to push back in a way that no one could ignore. The replacement of Tom's fence with a 10-foot steel wall was not a random act. It was a meticulously planned operation by Karen Mitchell, intended to force Tom into compliance with the HOA's draconian standards. The wall, erected overnight with industrial precision, was a physical manifestation of Karen's determination to impose her vision of perfection on every corner of Cedar Crest Estates. When Tom discovered the barrier, he was outraged, not only at the violation of his property rights, but also at the blatant disregard for the personal touches that made his homestead unique. Determined to fight back, Tom immediately set out to document the intrusion. He gathered every piece of evidence: high-resolution photos of the steel wall, time-stamped video footage from his security cameras, and even eyewitness account from neighbors who had noticed suspicious activity near his property in the dead of night. Each piece of evidence painted a clear picture. Karen had orchestrated the replacement of his fence, a move that was not only illegal but an affront to the spirit of independent living. Tom then filed a formal complaint with the HOA board, detailing the unauthorized construction and demanding immediate action. However, given Karen's long-standing influence on the board, Tom was skeptical that his grievance would be taken seriously. In Cedar Crest Estates, the board often turned a blind eye to the overzealous actions of their most notorious enforcer. But Tom was not one to be easily silenced. He knew that if he did not act decisively, Karen's tyranny would only grow bolder. Fueled by a deep sense of injustice and a desire to reclaim his autonomy, Tom began to plan his counterstrike. He decided that the best way to send a message was to transform the symbol of Karen's intrusion into a monument to his own resilience. Rather than simply repairing the fence, he would channel his frustration into a bold act of creative defiance, a new project that would not only restore his property, but also publicly challenge the HOA's draconian measures. After much thought, Tom conceived a plan that was as innovative as it was audacious. He would build a replacement fence that was even more imposing than the one Karen had forced upon him. Using his own funds and enlisting the help of local artisans, Tom began designing a custom fence that combined rustic charm with modern functionality, a fence that was as much a work of art as it was a protective barrier. The design featured intricately carved wooden panels, wrought iron accents, and even subtle LED lighting that highlighted its beauty at night. It was a clear statement that while Karen could impose her will with cold steel, true craftsmanship and personal expression could not be bought or mandated. As Tom's new fence took shape, word of the battle between him and Karen spread throughout the community. Neighbors, who had long grown tired of the HOA's oppressive standards, began to rally behind him. Social media erupted with support for Tom, and hashtags like #FenceFreedom and #StandUpForPropertyRights started trending in Cedar Crest Estates. Residents shared their own stories of fines and arbitrary rules, and soon a digital petition demanding reform of the HOA's enforcement practices was launched by Tom and quickly amassed thousands of signatures. The tension continued to build as the construction of the new fence progressed. Tom worked tirelessly, sometimes from dawn until dusk, alongside skilled craftsmen who shared his vision. Every log, every bolt, every artistic flourish was a defiant act of rebellion against a system that sought to erase individuality. The sound of hammers, saws, and the steady hum of construction filled the air, a counter-melody to the harsh clamor of bureaucratic control. Karen, for her part, remained unyielding in her stance. She publicly denounced Tom's project, calling it unauthorized vandalism and an affront to community standards. In interviews with local media, she argued that the original fence had been replaced for the greater good of the neighborhood's aesthetics. But her words rang hollow to a community already inspired by Tom's bold defiance. The digital evidence and the palpable support for Tom were a powerful counterweight to Karen's rhetoric. As the final panels of the new fence were installed, Tom stood back and surveyed his work, a stunning, custom-designed barrier that not only protected his property, but also celebrated the very freedom that Karen had tried to suppress. He knew that when Karen next saw his creation, she would be forced to confront the fact that property rights and individual expression were not negotiable. And as the sun set on that fateful day, the new fence stood as a gleaming testament to his resilience, ready to serve as the symbol of a community on the brink of change. In the days following the completion of Tom's new fence, the tension in Cedar Crest Estates escalated dramatically. Social media was ablaze with reactions to the stunning craftsmanship and the bold defiance embodied by the new structure. Videos and photos of the fence spread rapidly, accompanied by hashtags like #FenceFreedom, #PropertyRights, and #StandUpForCreativity. Neighbors who had long suffered under the oppressive regime of the HOA began to see Tom's victory as a rallying point for change, a symbol that personal property and creativity could prevail over bureaucratic tyranny. Local news outlets quickly picked up the story. Reporters drove through Cedar Crest Estates, capturing footage of the new fence illuminated by the soft glow of dusk, its intricate details a sharp contrast to the cold, impersonal steel wall that had once replaced Tom's original fence. Interviews with residents revealed a palpable sense of relief and empowerment. Tom's fence is more than just a barrier, it's a statement, one neighbor said during a live segment. It shows that we have the right to be different, to express ourselves, and to live on our own terms. The narrative evolved rapidly, with the community embracing Tom's vision as a celebration of individuality rather than a defiance of the rules. Within the HOA board, the growing public support for Tom's project sparked intense internal debates. Emergency meetings were held, and behind closed doors, board members clashed over how to address the issue. Some staunchly defended Karen's previous actions, insisting that rules were rules and that any deviation from the community's standards threatened the very fabric of Cedar Crest Estates. Others, swayed by the overwhelming digital evidence and the heartfelt testimonials of residents, argued that Karen's fines and arbitrary decisions had long suppressed the creative spirit of the neighborhood. Leaked minutes from these meetings revealed a sharp divide. One board member was quoted as saying, "If we continue to ignore the voices of our residents, we will lose the trust and integrity of this community." The internal turmoil signaled that change was inevitable. Tom's digital dossier, comprising high-resolution images of the new fence, detailed accounts of his struggles with the HOA, and supportive messages from neighbors, became the cornerstone of a grassroots movement. Online petitions demanding reform of the HOA's policies and accountability for arbitrary fines quickly amassed thousands of signatures. Social media influencers and local bloggers joined the conversation, lauding Tom's courage and heralding his fence as a symbol of resistance against oppressive regulation. When one person stands up for their rights, it inspires an entire community, one popular post read, echoing the sentiment that had taken hold throughout Cedar Crest Estates. Karen, however, was determined to maintain her grip on power. In a series of press conferences, she denounced Tom's project as illegal and disruptive, and vowed to take legal action against him. Her statements, delivered in a tone of barely contained rage, only fueled the public's disdain for her heavy-handed approach. Digital clips of her confrontations with neighbors and her dismissive attitude toward artistic expression were circulated widely, further tarnishing her reputation and galvanizing support for Tom. As the tension reached its peak, the HOA board announced that a final public hearing would be held to address the controversies surrounding property modifications and arbitrary fines. The announcement sent shockwaves through the community. In the days leading up to the hearing, neighbors gathered in local forums, sharing their experiences and preparing to voice their support. Tom organized small, informal meetings on his property, inviting fellow residents to view the new fence and discuss how the community could reclaim its right to individuality. The air was thick with anticipation as the day of the hearing arrived. The community center was packed with residents, many of whom carried signs emblazoned with slogans like, "Our property, our rules, and creativity over conformity." Live streams captured the vibrant energy of the crowd as hundreds of voices united in a single call for justice and reform. The digital petition, now boasting tens of thousands of signatures, was handed over to the board as undeniable evidence that the residents demanded change. Every shared post, every hashtag, every digital snippet from the past few weeks converged on one undeniable message. The days of arbitrary HOA fines and intrusive regulation were over. The stage was set for a final showdown that would force the board to either cling to outdated rules or embrace a new era where individual rights and creative expression were paramount. The decisive moment came on a crisp morning at the Cedar Crest Estates Community Center. The boardroom was packed with a diverse mix of HOA officials, local law enforcement representatives, community leaders, and hundreds of determined residents, all gathered for the final public hearing that would determine the future of property rights in our community. With a calm yet unyielding demeanor, Councilwoman Patricia Reynolds stepped up to the podium, her eyes reflecting the resolve of a community that had had enough. After a comprehensive review of all digital evidence, including time-stamped security footage of property modifications, detailed logs of fines, and the heartfelt testimonies of our residents, we have reached an inescapable conclusion. Councilwoman Reynolds began, her voice resonant with authority. It is abundantly clear that the actions taken by Mrs. Karen Mitchell, specifically her baseless fines and attempts to enforce a uniform aesthetic at the expense of individual creativity, were driven not by any genuine concern for our community, but by personal bias and an abuse of power. Our community's rights as property owners and creative individuals must be upheld. A heavy silence fell over the room as Reynolds continued. Effective immediately, the HOA board will rescind all fines related to property modifications and initiate a full disciplinary review of the practices that allowed such overreach. Furthermore, we will implement new guidelines that guarantee the protection of every resident's right to manage and decorate their property as they see fit. Today's vote is not merely about reversing an arbitrary decision. It is a resounding declaration that Cedar Crest Estates will stand for fairness, innovation, and the inalienable right to self-expression. Her words struck a chord, and murmurs of approval spread throughout the assembly. At that moment, a longtime community advocate, known for his unwavering defense of individual freedoms, rose to speak. "Today we stand united," he declared, his voice firm and impassioned. "No resident should be forced to sacrifice their creative spirit or their property rights to satisfy someone else's vision of perfection. Let this vote be the turning point, a clear signal that we will defend our right to live and innovate without arbitrary interference. We demand accountability, and we will not rest until every violation of our rights is met with swift, decisive action." His declaration was met with thunderous applause, uniting the room in a resounding call for reform. Following his address, a senior officer from the local regulatory commission presented the final dossier, a meticulously compiled record of all digital evidence, expert evaluations of property modifications, and official documents that confirmed the legality of Tom's new fence. The evidence was irrefutable. The 10-foot steel wall that had once replaced Tom's original fence was a unilateral, unauthorized act of vandalism by Karen Mitchell, and his subsequent construction of a custom, artful replacement was a lawful and creative exercise of his property rights. The Internal Affairs Panel unanimously endorsed strict disciplinary measures for any abuse of power, and the full report was scheduled for immediate public release. Councilwoman Reynolds concluded, "Let this resolution mark the dawn of a new era for Cedar Crest Estates, a community where every resident's rights and creative expressions are celebrated, and where public authority is exercised with fairness and integrity." Our vote today is a resounding declaration that we will protect our freedoms and that no one, no matter how self-righteous, can impose their will upon our community without accountability. Together, we stand for justice, transparency, and the right to live and innovate on our own terms. Her final words, delivered with unwavering conviction, sealed the turning point in our struggle for property rights and creative freedom. In that defining moment, as every face in the boardroom shone with determination and hope, the balance of power shifted irrevocably. The overwhelming digital evidence and a unified voice of the community forced the HOA board to take decisive action, a turning point that would forever reshape the governance of Cedar Crest Estates. The days of petty fines and rigid conformity were over, and a future built on respect for individual rights and creativity was finally within our grasp. In the weeks following the historic vote, Cedar Crest Estates underwent a profound transformation. News of the rescinded fines and sweeping reforms implemented by the HOA board spread like wildfire through local media and on social networks, sparking impassioned debates about property rights, creative freedom, and the importance of innovation. Editorials in the local newspaper, with headlines such as "A New Dawn for Cedar Crest" and "Community United for Freedom," celebrated the decisive action taken to protect every resident's right to manage their own property and express themselves without fear of arbitrary punishment. Hashtags like #PropertyRights, #NoMoreHOA, and #ArtIsFreedom trended widely, reinforcing the community's determination to stand up against oppressive enforcement. Town hall meetings and community forums saw record attendance as residents gathered to share their own experiences and to envision a future free from bureaucratic overreach. Neighbors who had long lived in fear of arbitrary fines and intrusive inspections now spoke openly about their right to live on their own terms, on their own property. "Our land is our legacy," one impassioned resident declared at a bustling meeting, "and we must protect it at all costs." The atmosphere was one of hope and renewal, a promise that Cedar Crest Estates would always honor the creative spirit and individuality of its residents. Within the reformed HOA board and local regulatory bodies, swift changes were implemented. Senior officials, led by Director James Carter and Lieutenant Marcus Reed, launched comprehensive training programs on ethical conduct, cultural sensitivity, and the responsible management of community resources. Regular internal audits and transparent disciplinary procedures were established to ensure that every complaint was rigorously scrutinized and that no resident would ever again be subjected to arbitrary fines or oppressive interference. "Our duty is to protect the rights and dignity of every member of our community," Lieutenant Reed affirmed during a follow-up press conference, reinforcing the renewed commitment to justice and integrity. Community leaders and local civil rights organizations mobilized further, organizing workshops, public forums, and educational campaigns to empower residents and to underscore the importance of property rights and creative freedom. When we stand together, our voices are powerful enough to dismantle even the most outdated systems. A local activist proclaimed at a town hall meeting, inspiring neighbors to unite in the fight for a more inclusive and just governance model. For Tom, the journey from confrontation to resolution was both deeply personal and profoundly transformative. His decision to fight back against the arbitrary fines imposed by HOA Karen, a decision that culminated in the replacement of a belittled fence with a bold 10-foot steel wall and the subsequent rallying cry for property rights, had not only reclaimed his personal freedom, but had ignited a movement that resonated throughout Cedar Crest Estates. Neighbors who had long suffered under the oppressive enforcement of conformity found their voices and shared their own stories of resistance. The digital evidence that exposed the absurdity of Karen's fines became a beacon of hope and a rallying cry for every resident who believed that creative expression and personal property rights were inalienable. Karen Mitchell, once the feared enforcer of the HOA's draconian policies, was now reduced to a cautionary tale, a stark reminder that no one is above accountability when a community stands united for justice. Her influence waned rapidly, and digital records of her past transgressions circulated widely, underscoring the need for reform and the dangers of unchecked authority. At a final celebratory event held in the Central Park of Cedar Crest Estates, residents, local officials, and community advocates gathered beneath the gentle glow of the setting sun. A large banner reading "Unity, Freedom, and Creative Expression" was unfurled between towering oaks, and heartfelt speeches echoed promises of a brighter, more inclusive future. Today, we celebrate our victory over arbitrary rule, a victory for every homeowner and every creative soul in our community, Councilwoman Reynolds proclaimed, her voice ringing with determination. The standing ovation that followed was a powerful affirmation of the community's collective commitment to protect its freedoms and ensure that no one could ever again abuse public power. As each new day dawned over Cedar Crest Estates, the legacy of that fateful confrontation endured as a beacon of transformative change. The story of how HOA Karen's relentless attempts to enforce conformity were met with a bold display of personal freedom. The 10-foot steel wall that replaced a beloved fence became a rallying cry for every resident who believed in the sanctity of private property and the right to live and innovate freely. Every sunrise now carried the promise that in Cedar Crest Estates, truth, justice, and individual freedom would forever prevail. In the end, what began as a personal battle evolved into a watershed moment for the entire community. United, vigilant, and empowered by the power of creative resistance, the residents of Cedar Crest Estates emerged stronger and more determined than ever to safeguard their rights against any form of bureaucratic overreach. And as the sun rose each morning over their reclaimed neighborhood, it carried with it the promise that Cedar Crest Estates would forever be a place where creativity, integrity, and respect for individual expression shone as brightly as the dawn.